Hi everyone, Matt here again. In the last video we talked about the counterexample method. In this video we're going to talk about extended arguments, or what are sometimes called argument patterns. In general, there are two basic argument patterns, one called the vertical pattern and one called the horizontal pattern. Now, what are we talking about with patterns here? What we're talking about is the way that premises are related to one another and the way that premises are related to conclusions. When we were learning the counterexample method, we learned to isolate the form of an argument, and we could see the argument structure in that way. Well, this is another way of visualizing argument structure because not all premises support conclusions in the same way. And since that is the case, it's helpful to visualize, using these argument patterns, how premises support conclusions and how premises are related to each other. And the reason this is important is because if you have an argument for some conclusion and you find out that one of the premises is false, does that mean the argument is wrecked and no good anymore? Well, it depends. It depends on how the premises are related to one another and how the premises are related to the conclusion. So let's take a look and I'll show you what I mean. So here's an example of an argument. We've got four statements here. Selling human organs ought to be outlawed. Allowing them to be sold will lead to a situation in which only rich people will be able to afford the transplants, because whenever something scarce is on the market, the price always goes up. And 4 is the law of supply and demand requires it. The first thing that we need to do when we are looking at argument patterns is determine which one of these statements is the conclusion. This one has no indicator words, so the inferential claim is implicit. You've got to think about what they are trying to convince you of in order to figure out what the conclusion is. In this case, the conclusion is the first statement. Selling human organs ought to be outlawed. Then we're given 3 reasons in support of that conclusion. Now, we have to think about how are these premises related to one another? Do the premises depend on one another? Or do the premises support the conclusion all by themselves? So one way to think about this, we can tell the difference between the vertical pattern and the horizontal pattern based on the answer to this question, whether or not the premises depend on each other or on a previous premise, or whether each premise provides independent support for the conclusion. So that's what the question we have to ask ourselves, the first question. Do these premises depend on one another, or does each premise support the conclusion on its own? So one way we can figure this out is think about an individual premise, 2, 3, or 4, and think about whether or not it supports the conclusion. So think about 2 all by itself. Forget 3 and 4. Does allowing them to be sold leading to a situation in which only rich will be able to afford transplants, does that support the conclusion? Well, it kind of does. That's a reason that someone might think for believing 2. What about 3 all by itself? Whenever something scarce is on the market, the price goes up. Well, kind of. You might think that that leads to the conclusion. But as we move forward to the 4th one, we see that we're getting farther and farther away from the premises supporting the conclusion all by themselves. So the law of supply and demand requires the price goes up. Well, does the law of supply and demand support that conclusion all by itself? Well, no, it doesn't. It actually depends on other premises to support the conclusion. So this is an example of what's called the vertical pattern. We're going to draw these patterns when we do the homework like this. So remember, number 1 was our conclusion, selling human organs ought to be outlawed. 2 was the only one that really supported the conclusion, so we put that one next, right here. Number 3 was about things that are scarce, the price goes up. And number 4 was the law of supply and demand. So number 4 supports number 3, number 3 supports number 2, and number 2 supports number 1. So this is the way vertical patterns are going to look when we draw them out. And one of the reasons why we draw them like this is because each section in this argument functions like another little mini argument. So this is the conclusion, and this is the premise. And you could think of this being another conclusion, and this being another premise, and so on. And this is the way vertical pattern arguments work. It's like a logical progression where each premise supports the next, and they form a chain of reasoning until you get to the conclusion. Let's take a look at this one. First, we got to figure out what the conclusion is, because again, there's no indicator words that tell us what the conclusion is. We have an implicit inferential claim. So which one is the conclusion? You can go ahead and pause now and think about it. The conclusion of this one is we should not build more nuclear power plants in the U.S. And we're given 3 reasons. Nuclear power is dangerous, it's unfair to future generations, and it's not essential. Now, do any of these support the conclusion all by themselves? Well, is the fact that nuclear power is dangerous a reason not to build more nuclear power plants? Well, yeah, kinda. I can see somebody making that argument. Now let's think about 3 all by itself. If we assume that number 3 is true, is that a reason for number 1? And yeah, again, this one all by itself supports the conclusion. And then finally 4, the power from these plants is not essential. That's definitely a reason not to build them. So each one of these premises supports the conclusion all by themselves. They don't depend on one another. We could omit one of these premises and 2 and 3 still give support for 1. They are not connected in that way. So we're going to draw the horizontal pattern like this, where the conclusion's at the bottom again, and each premise has its own arrow pointing to the conclusion, showing that each premise supports the conclusion all by itself. They don't depend on one another like the vertical pattern. So so far we've got the vertical pattern straight up and down, where one premise leads to the next, and we've got the horizontal pattern here where they are each independently supporting the conclusion. Now there's a couple of complications. Sometimes we're going to run across arguments with conjoint premises. And conjoint premises are kind of like vertical pattern arguments, but the way the premises are connected to one another is different than the regular straight up and down vertical pattern argument. When you have conjoined premises, each premise depends on each other in a way that when you omit one, then the support that the other ones provide is lowered, diminished, or destroyed. But conjoined premises do not function like little mini argument. You can't say from one premise to the next, like, here's a premise, therefore, like the little mini arguments that we talked about. I'll show you an example of conjoint premises next. And finally, multiple conclusions. Sometimes one premise supports more than one conclusion. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, let's look at an example. So this one, we've got an indicator word that shows us that number 4 is our conclusion. Therefore, the defendant is probably guilty of the drive-by. And we're given 3 premises, 3 reasons for this conclusion. White Jags are rare, the defendant owns a white Jag, and the car from which the fatal shots fired has been identified by witnesses as a white Jag. So the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, do any of these premises all by themselves support the conclusion? So let's go one by one and ask ourselves, do each of these premises support the conclusion? First, does the fact that white Jags are rare in this area support the conclusion that the defendant is guilty of a drive-by murder? No. Just because white Jags are rare doesn't prove that somebody's guilty of murder. What about the fact that the defendant owns one? So you have to forget about 1 and 3. I'm just talking about 2. Does the fact that the defendant owns a white Jag mean that the defendant is probably guilty? No. 2 doesn't support the conclusion by itself either. What about 3? The car from which the fatal shots fired was identified as a white Jag. Does that all by itself show that the defendant is guilty? In this case, no. That by itself doesn't show that the defendant is guilty. We've got to connect the defendant to the car. And that's what number 2 does. It connects the defendant to the car. So none of these premises support the conclusion by themselves. We need each premise to support the conclusion. So the next question we need to ask are, do 1, 2, and 3 support each other? Are we going to have the straight up and down vertical argument where one premise logically leads us to the next, and that premise logically leads us to the next, and that premise leads us to the conclusion? And the answer to this one is going to be no. And the way that you can think about this is think about whether any of these premises could be evidence for one of the other premises. So let's start with number 1. Is the fact that white Jags are rare in this area evidence that the defendant owns a white Jag? No, of course not. What kind of evidence would convince you that the defendant owns a white Jag? Well, I want to see some kind of records, a pink slip, or DMV records, or the sales records from the car lot where they bought the white Jag. And we don't have that in 1. Just the fact that white Jags are rare doesn't mean the defendant owns 1. So 1 doesn't support 2. Does 2 support 3? Does the fact that the defendant owns a white Jag lead you to believe or count as evidence that the car from which the fatal shots were fired was identified by witnesses as a white Jag? No! That doesn't work either. What kind of evidence would convince you of 3? Well, I want to hear the testimony of the witnesses. That would convince me. So none of these premises are evidence for each other. We could think about any relationship from 1, 2, and 3 that we want, and none of them are going to be evidence for each other. So this is not the straight up and down vertical pattern that we've seen before. This is actually conjoined premises, and we're going to draw the conjoined premises like this, where they're connected with a bracket. Now think about it. What makes the conjoined premises is that they depend on one another. But they depend on one another in a different way than the vertical pattern because they aren't evidence for each other. So notice we don't have an arrow pointing from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 or 3 to 1 or in any direction. There's no arrows up here pointing to each other because none of these premises counts as evidence for one another. But they still depend on one another. Because if we left any one of these out, then it's going to weaken or destroy the support the other premises give. So if we left out the fact that white Jags are rare in this area, then that's going to weaken this argument tremendously. Just the fact that the defendant owns a white Jag and the shots were fired from the white Jag doesn't mean that the defendant is probably guilty if we live in an area where everybody's got a white Jag. Similarly, if all we have is white Jags are rare in this area and the car from which the fatal shots fired was identified as a white Jag, if we're leaving out 2, then we still don't have enough evidence. It destroys the support because we have no connection between the defendant and the car. And finally, if we leave out number 3, so we've got white Jags are rare, the defendant owns one, but we leave out this bit of evidence, then again, we don't have enough evidence for the conclusion. So what? The defendant owns a white Jag and Jags are rare. That just shows that they're rich. It doesn't show anything about whether or not they committed a drive-by murder. So each of these premises is required in order to support the conclusion. They depend on one another, but they don't depend on one another in the premise conclusion format. They depend on one another in the conjoined premise format. Because if we left one of these out, then that would destroy or weaken the support that the others give. All right, let's look at one final example. This is going to be an example of an argument that has multiple forms in it. So we've got vertical pattern, straight up and down vertical. We've got horizontal, and we've got conjoined premises. And our complicated arguments can use any and all of these in different combinations. So you can have an argument with horizontal and conjoined and vertical all in one, because arguments can be complicated. So first, what's the conclusion of this one? The conclusion of this one is number 1. Alice should be found not guilty. Now we have to think about it. Do any of these premises support the conclusion all by themselves? Well, it seems like number 2, if any of these arguments is going to support the conclusion, number 2 it has the best case. First, well, if you've ever watched any crime dramas, you know that when a lawyer is trying to prove that somebody's guilty or not guilty, one of the main things they talk about is motive. If you can prove that somebody didn't have any motive to commit a crime, then you're going a long way to committing that they probably didn't. They probably shouldn't be found guilty of that crime. So think about this for number 2. She had no motive. This seems to support the conclusion all by itself. We've also got some contextual clues within the way that the sentence is structured. So 2 is, we have because 2. Because is a premise indicator. And since they're all in the same sentence, the person who wrote this is trying to give you a clue that this is number 2 is a premise that supports the conclusion all by itself. Now think about number 3, 4, and 5. How are number 3, 4, and 5 related to each other, to the other premise, and to the conclusion? It seems like they're all in reference to whether she had a motive for robbery, because usually people who have a motive for robbery need money or want money. But they're trying to say that she didn't need the money. So her not needing the money seems to support the fact that she had no motive. Now, if that's true, then how are 4 and 5 related? Well, 4 and 5 seem to show that she didn't need the money. So if her parents were wealthy and her checking account had $8,000 in it, then she probably didn't need any money. And if she didn't need any money, then she had no motive. And if she had no motive, then why should we believe that she committed a robbery? We can also think of the contextual clues here. In between 4 and 5, we've got a comma and. So it seems to show that these two are connected. In between 3 and 4, we've got a semicolon. So that's like a hard stop, like a period. That's making a disconnect between 3 and 5, whereas the comma and makes a connection between 4 and 5. So 3 seems to support 2 by itself, but 4 and 5 both seem to support 3. Now, if that's true, then the next question is, well, how do 4 and 5 both support premise 3? Do they support premise 3 in the straight up and down vertical sense, or are they conjoined? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, does 4 count as evidence for 5, or does 5 count as evidence for 4? So, let me ask you this. What's going to convince you that her parents are wealthy? Is the fact that her checking account has $8,000 in it evidence that her parents are wealthy? No, because she could have worked hard for that money on her own, or won the lottery, or whatever. How about what's evidence for her checking account having $8,000 in it? Is the fact that her parents are wealthy evidence that her checking account has $8,000 in it? Well, it's not going to convince me. How would somebody convince me that their checking account has $8,000 in it? Well, I want to see a bank statement, and number 4 doesn't have a bank statement in it. Just because her parents are wealthy doesn't mean that she's got $8,000 in her checking account. So neither one of these is evidence for one another. But it seems like they're both still needed in order to support 4. Because if we left one of these out, then that weakens or diminishes the support the other gives. Just because her parents were wealthy doesn't mean she doesn't need money. She might be estranged from her parents. And so, these two seem to depend on one another. If we left one out, it weakens the support of the other. So we're going to say that 4 and 5 are conjoined. They support 3. 3 supports 2 and 2 supports 1. So we've got an example where 1, 2, and 3 are straight up and down vertical, with 3 leading to 2, 2 leading to 1, and then 4 and 5 are conjoined, and they support 3. So these are examples of the extended arguments, argument patterns, and you'll see more examples of this within MindTap. So if you've got any questions, as always, let me know.